Hey guys, so I bothered to record a full read of my Atlas Shrugged Parts 1 and 2 review, and this was like months ago. But the problem was that I basically wrote it as I was watching, and I watched Atlas Shrugged Part 2 before I watched Atlas Shrugged Part 1. Now, I've already read most of the book. You know, it is a long book. It's incredibly boring, and it was written by an insane woman who... Actually, I'm not going to make ad hominem remarks like that about Ayn Rand, because, frankly, I just don't care that much about Ayn Rand and everything about her. Anyway, so what I find is that after reviewing the audio from what I tried to do, which was read my my review of Atlas Shrugged Part 1 before Atlas Shrugged Part 2, it ended up becoming a big jumbled mess, because in Atlas Shrugged Part 1, the review of that, I ended up making just a big mess referring back to Atlas Shrugged Part 2. So I'm going to just read for you the Atlas Shrugged Part 2 review, then the middle review that I did, which was for Branded, and I make a lot of references back and forth between Atlas Shrugged versus Branded, and then the review of Atlas Shrugged Part 1. So, this is going to be long. I'm not gonna kid you on that. But with Part 3 of Atlas Shrugged coming out this year, and also with the fact that Branded is such a unique film compared to the Randian perspective and the consumerist perspective, it's really worth drawing the comparison. And I was actually really glad that I bothered to watch and review Branded alongside Parts 1 and 2 of Atlas Shrugged. So anyway, here we go. Atlas Shrugged Part 2. Based on what is considered Ayn Rand's opus, Atlas Shrugged is about a mythologically benevolent group of wealthy elites who have been held back by the lack of a true meritocracy. We're given the introduction that it is the quote-unquote near future, even though the book was written decades ago, in the 1940s and 50s. And told that fuel costs for energy have made railroads sort of the mandatory form of transportation. Now, this is to compensate for the fact that Rand wrote the book in that time, and that's when people still took trains. So as a result, the railroad is an important plot device to the story. Now we use cars, planes, that sort of thing. So for how all prophetic people try to make this book sound, it's actually not that prophetic. It's very much based in a 19th century mode of thinking. Our heroine, or protagonist, however you wish to call it, Dagny Taggart, is flying a jet through the mountains, following another plane. As a film walking in, not having seen the first half, the viewer has no idea what's going on. Finally, the plane she follows disappears, and as her plane shorts out, she asks, "Who is John Galt?" The opening title is shown and cut to 9 months earlier, where we see the heroine and Robert Picardo, the EMH from Star Trek Voyager, riding on a tiny rail car through a long dark tunnel. As he outlines Rand's umpteenth plot device, a machine that gathers static electricity from the air. This is, like much of Rand's plot devices, based on the work of Nikola Tesla. As with all Randian contemporaries, there is mockery of the Occupy movement, just to make the outdated tome seem relevant to today. And that's just kind of stuck in there. Not even kidding. Right after the scene of the static engine. Part of the problem with the film already is that it's the quote-unquote near future, and we haven't switched to solar and wind power and biofuels, which is already currently happening in the year 2012, 2013, and 2014. This is supposed to take place in 2016. Anyway, this is to say nothing of the huge subsidies that the U.S. government pays from taxes to keep petroleum prices down. It shows how out of touch the filmmakers really are with reality. An expanded future railroad system would either run on biodiesel or electricity, including maglev trains, which are already in development by the same entrepreneurs that Rand would praise. You know, for all the talk of the static motor, solar panels and wind turbines decentralize the power grid too, and could easily power electric trains running between cities and power plants. But then, I'm not one of Rand's wealthy elites, so I don't matter because I have a bit more humility about these things. And of course, they only use Apple computers in the film because Steve Jobs is considered one of them. A line that I cannot stand is, "It's the job that you choose," or simply, "It's the job you choose." This is a sentence uttered by people who think that there are different jobs presenting themselves to individuals, like jobs are just flowers that you pick up from a field. Employment in the United States of America is like finding $1 on the street, a carrot dangling from the end of a stick in the real world. We don't get jobs of our choice, or nobody would work at a call center, or waiting tables, or bussing tables for that matter. I mean, unless it was like a side job and they were getting something else out of it. In the same exchange as the aforementioned line, a government representative is offering to buy a large order of redone metal at price, but because it's for the State Science Institute, who earlier had denounced it, redone won't sell. His ego gets bruised, so the gravelly-voiced Reardon decides that nobody from the SSI can buy his metal. Does everyone who wants to buy something from Reardon have to kiss his butt? Or is it from any Randian? Now, just to give you a quick recap before we go any further, Reardon metal is basically unobtainium. It's ridiculously strong, extremely light. It has really good electrical conductivity, and at the same time it doesn't heat up, too ridiculously. Now, it's supposed to be a blend of metals. It's supposed to be this kind of alchemist's blend of metals that forms basically this ultimate metal, this perfect metal for all purposes that you could find, and in different things. It would be good for wiring, it would be good for construction, it would be good for all these different things. It doesn't corrode or whatever, so it's basically unobtainium. It is the impossible metal that is supposed to be perfect for everything, and you would never have to have any other kind of metal that you would ever have to make, and it's cheap to produce, and you get the point. It is not a metal that could logically be produced given the certain properties that it has, certain properties which are attributed to other metals which have other properties that are undesirable, such as gold is a very good conductor, but it's not very strong, whereas stronger metals like aluminum are lightweight, strong as steel, but can be a bit brittle. They can have other problems depending on how you make them. So, point being, this is Reardon metal. It's this really nice thing that's basically impossible to have in the real world, but Reardon comes out with it, and he's going to take the world by storm with this innovative idea that he has the patent on. And a government agency denounces it, because why not? And right away we have this ridiculousness, because he doesn't want to share his patent with the world. He doesn't want to share the formula or the chemical makeup of Reardon metal with anyone. He's just keeping it to himself and owns a patent on it and wants to make money on it. Because of that, people denounce it, and that would not happen in the real world at all. And even if it did, the United States is not the only buyer of metal. China buys metal. We have Canada, which produces tons of stuff with Reardon metal, or with metal anyway, and would use Reardon metal, for a lot of its things, and has its own independent mind on things. It doesn't just take whatever some institute in America says. I mean, otherwise, for goodness sakes, we wouldn't have high fructose corn syrup in everything you eat. So, that's kind of the end of that rant. Sorry. Anyway, another stupid line occurs when Reardon is told that in tough times, it's important to keep to rigid principles. Although I only see pride in this particular instance. Scratch that. Another stupid line is when Reardon is told that these are tough times, and he should be willing to share his the secrets of his product with people. He says it's important to keep to rigid principles, although I only see pride in this instance, which isn't really a principle. Reardon tells the representative from the government, Mr. Small, to try pouring a ton of steel without rigid principles. What the does that mean? I mean, that's like when Phantom Limb says that revenge is like gazpacho soup and is best served cold and precise, and the monarch says, yes, you can never have enough precision in your soup. I mean, is this a thing? Are principles a part of manufacturing steel or something like that? I don't know. Anyway, in the next scene, Dagny's brother James is just giving away money, which seems really dumb. I mean, it's just like he's literally just throwing away money and just giving it to people, and it's like, what? That's just, that is not something that a person does. Anyway, it's obviously supposed to be a metaphor for like donating to charity or something like that. But then comes my biggest upset. Larissa Oleynik, whom I grew up watching with a big crush, plays a checkout girl in this movie. And this is going to be James Taggart's love interest and eventually his wife and everything. And the whole idea is that, he basically marries out of infatuation instead of what is actual love. Rand had this big thing against love. Love was an emotion. It made you soft. It made you weak. This comes from the fact that in Rand's own personal life, I know I wasn't going to try and make this personal about Rand, but this is where her ideations come from. Apparently, Rand was molested by her father, and there are some serious unresolved issues from that when Rand is writing this. In her life, she feels that love is not a real thing, that it's just a an animal instinct for the purposes of whatever, and that it's actually counter to what it is to be a really great person, that you cannot love others than yourself. Rand was a messed up cookie, okay? She was not a happy bunny. So Ayn Rand basically looks at this as a rich guy falling in love with a cashier, basically being, just an example of how stupid love is, and how it has no rhyme or reason, and how love really doesn't matter in the end. So James Taggart's relationship is meant to be illustrative of what is wrong with a normal relationship, except that most people don't get married like that. James Taggart is meant to be the goofus to Dagny's gallant, if you'll follow the metaphor, but it falls apart quickly, because the fact is that yes, James does things that you shouldn't necessarily do, but James does things that I've never known anyone to do ever. I mean, really, just throwing money away and giving it away to people, and getting married to a person that he barely knows, who's just like working class or whatever. Yeah. Anyway, with regards to Larissa Oleynik, I was relieved to read in an interview by AMC from March 4th, 2013, that she doesn't really agree with everything that Rand says. So for a moment, my heart was really broken. And in fact, for part 3, Oleynik refused to come back, apparently. She just didn't opt to come back for the part. You'll notice this in parts 1 and 2, that they don't get a lot of recurring cast members except for people who ascribe to libertarian or objectivist beliefs. So, you have these Randians who want themselves in the movie because, this is our great opus, this is our tribute to one of our greatest thinkers, but they can't keep cast members. And as the production goes from part 1 to part 2, the budget increases a little bit. They got a little bit more money around the time part 2 came out. But for part 3, apparently they had to do a Kickstarter campaign. So for all the talk of how evil altruism is, they basically relied on altruism in order to make their movie. I mean, can you believe that? Okay. So, at this point, Dagny has decided to create a new line in their rail system that's going to be made with redone metal, and it's going to be really fantastic, and it's going to be a high-speed train that does really cool things, and it's going to be called the John Galt line. But it's going to be like a sub-company separate from Taggart. And anyway, so that's what she's doing. And James tries to take credit for the John Galt rail lane. And he uses the checkout girl, her admiration of him, to then pick her up. And that's basically where we leave off with that story. We don't find out what happens. He just tries to pick her up, but then we go to a piano concert, a piano recital. I won't say a recital; it's actually a concert. And we witness the disappearance of a pianist in the middle of a concert. And we later learn that James proposed to marry the checkout girl. It's not really important that we discuss the character's name because they don't really matter in the sense of the story. They're just there as placeholders, as cardboard cutouts. They're very one-dimensional. Their motivations are not really explored. And this is kind of why Rand is not a very good writer. Actually, this is one of the main reasons why Rand is not a very good writer, is the motivations explored are only that of the protagonist. They're expounded upon only in dialogue. They're not really explored in actual writing. And the philosophical line of thinking is very myopic. So anyway, at the reception for the newlywed couple, there's a notable cameo by Teller from Penn and Teller. And apparently Penn and Teller are libertarians, and he's basically telling Dagny that it's dangerous outside. And I'm surprised because they give him a lot of screen time in that scene. So, I don't know, maybe he donated a lot to the film. And it's weird because Sean Hannity got a lot of screen time on this too. Supposedly from like his show or something, and they just like put that in to be like, see, this is just like our real world. In only a couple of years, cars will be completely passé, and everyone will be riding trains, and Sean Hannity will still be on the air and telling you things. So it's for the average Fox News viewer to be like, see, that's just like reality. That's what's happening right now, and Sean Hannity's telling the truth. Anyway, so it's really weird. They try to make it seem like it's really going to happen and whatnot, like it's some kind of prophecy, but the thing is, at that point, it's very hard to treat this film as anything but propaganda. I mean, for example, the newscasts in the film have people who act like they don't even watch the news, let alone have reported for the news. They just look like news anchors. So, they put them in suits, give them makeup and hair, and put them on camera in front of news sets, and, there you go. That's your newscast, even though they don't read anything like actual newscasters read them. Okay, as things progress through the first 30 minutes, bear in mind, we're only 30 minutes in at this point. It's basically just another film that glamorizes the lifestyle of the uber wealthy. Anyone who's common or trusting of others is stupid, and empathy or altruism is just a weakness or suffers from flawed thinking. Remember that all of the philosophy in this allegory comes from a person who thinks that Atlas held up the world, when actually in the mythos, Atlas held up the sky. So Atlas is actually keeping us from reaching the stars. That's why the most prominent line of space rockets in NASA history have been called Atlas. So Atlas shrugging would just mean that the sky would move up and down a bit, or even move lower. So if Atlas just kind of shrugged and walked off, suddenly we could reach the stars. If we're following the metaphor, that's not such a bad thing. But according to Rand, it is. Okay. So, at the wedding reception for James Taggart, his new wife tries to tell Dagny off, saying that she's the woman in the family now, and Dagny replies that she's the man. So this is kind of part of the problem with Rand. Even though she's looked on by some as a feminist icon, she still believes that men are the ones who are inherently powerful and competent, and that women are meant to be weaker and incompetent. So Dagny, and by association Rand, calls James a woman as if that's supposed to mean anything. He calls James a woman and says that Dagny is the man in the family because James is soft and incompetent. I mean, that doesn't really work. You know, it doesn't really make sense. That's very heteronormative, very much not a feminist way of phrasing things. So, you know, Rand's credentials as any kind of feminist just fall out the window right at that point. Ironically, the wedding reception for James Taggart and his new wife is interrupted by one of Dagny's friends talking about how someone who takes from those who produce is a looter. But, since workers produce goods, shouldn't they get a fair share? Enough to live on and save up so that they can get a start of a business for themselves and hire workers of their own? I mean, that's what we're talking about. If a person produces, then they should get a fair wage. But Randians don't want to pay even a minimum wage, let alone a living wage, very often. You know? So we can't just say like, oh, well, I'm willing to pay you in order to do me a service. Remember that when businesses were unbridled and were not forced to pay a minimum wage or a living wage of any kind and not offer any benefits, that they exploited people and would pay them, you know, so much at a time. And then they would own the store that you bought everything from, so that you couldn't really, you were just giving whatever wages you earned right back to the factory owner, and the prices would be whatever the owner felt like. So it was a lateral monopolizing, so that they owned everything in your life, and you were essentially a slave, and you had nothing to save up for yourself. You couldn't own your own home. That home belonged to the company. This happened in mine towns, mill towns, factory towns, all these. And it was notorious for happening. You know, they owned the bank, they owned everything in town, so that there was no getting out from under their thumb, and they were not accountable to you. And what was even worse was that some towns like that even printed their own money and paid the employees in that cash, so that all of their money was basically worthless. It was basically like trying to have your own little dictatorship, where whatever you said went. And if you didn't like it, then you could just go. Only problem was that the money that they would give you, their own currency, had no cash value. So all the money that they gave you wasn't worth anything. It was just a token to exchange for basically food and soap and clothing and basic necessities like that. So, you know, that's the reality of a corporate-run America. That's the reality of a no government system. You know, so when you're watching Atlas Shrugged and looking at the world like that, that's the reality that you're looking at eventually. You know, and the very contrived system of government that they try to say will happen is utter nonsense. But we'll get into that a little bit more. The fact is that capitalists like Mitt Romney, for instance, loot companies and lay off employees like they're throwing cards into a hat. They destroy towns and communities. They hoard money instead of letting it being used within the very system that they see keeps itself alive by using money to pay for providing goods and services. These are people who think that taxes are unfair because that's someone taking something from you. One of the best parts about the Bioshock series is that we get to see what Randian or libertarian utopias would be like, and just how much they wouldn't work, and would quickly break down into chaos. Part of the problem I see with all of these people is that there is no nobility, no love, grace, or character, nothing magnanimous. The filmmakers paint Rand's vision of humanity as scrounging, thieving animals trying to take what was earned by the important people. By this reasoning, Mitt Romney is a James Taggart, and a lot of other Republican leaders are James Taggarts. I mean, George W. Bush was the biggest James Taggart of them all. He didn't give away money, but all of his businesses that he ran failed. We have to think about this. This is the reality. Typically, the wealthy are supported by the workers, not vice versa. So to view themselves as giants holding up the world and who are above the law is the height of vanity. One more ironic point about the umpteenth philosophical dialogue of the story is that when Daniger talks about the fair share law, and he says, you know, you have to sell to someone and charge the same flat rate, these are the same people who think that flat tax is a great idea. Because if you work hard enough, then you won't go to prison for failing to pay taxes. Except that is not the way the world works. If you believe that owners should control businesses like despots and charge whatever they like, then you cannot be against charging different tax rates based on income and assets. Okay, so another plot hole comes up right away because the president orders that in order to change the conditions from a state of emergency, that nobody can invent anything new, and no company can produce more or less of its products. So that's completely insane, and that would not change anything from the state of emergency. Nobody would ever suggest doing that. In fact, I'm pretty sure that most presidents, first off, wouldn't really be able to give that order at all, and wouldn't try to. But more importantly, that would not fix any kind of crisis. In fact, this economy is currently doing better in the year 2014 than it ever was during the Bush presidency. This economy has improved from what was the death throes, what got our economy lowered from an A rating. Anyway, so what Randians are trying to create in this story is a government taking over businesses and creating stagnation. But government regulation of private businesses has not hurt any profits within the past century aside from prohibition of alcohol. We learned our lesson there, but deregulation of businesses caused the Dust Bowl, the Great Depression, the recent recession, and the list goes on. For the Taggart Tunnel accident, a lot of things coincide a little bit too conveniently. If this rail system is run so well by Dagny, then why is it always breaking down? One could blame all of what Dagny calls the quote-unquote quality people being absent, as they show others stammering and not knowing what to do, and then appointing people with no competency to just fill in. I mean, first off, this is what training is for. This is what having different shifts are for, okay? You don't just have one person working a particular job 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You have someone trained, and then they fill in. If they aren't there, if they simply are not there, then you have someone observe what they're doing. You have manuals, you have guidelines, you have instructions for this system so that if a person is out of commission, if they die in an accident in some way, they can be supplemented. I won't say replaced, but they can be supplemented in an emergency. I don't think that that's that weird an idea to call up, because that's what people actually do. And by saying that there are quality people and then everyone else, that's setting up a weird binary dynamic that is not necessarily true. And in fact, psychologists have found that this is not actually the case, that there aren't just some people who are good and competent at things and some people who are just stupid. You know, a lot of it is cultural. A lot of it is the brain pathways, the neural pathways that we build up over time from habits that are reinforced by the outside world, not just by will or choice or realization that self is more important than anything else or something weird like that. Okay? But anyway, they also happen to have a tunnel that is miles long, and they don't bother putting in any kind of ventilation apparently, because even passive ventilation would be enough. And you still need ventilation in the case of diesel engines. But apparently they used some old steam locomotive, and now the compartments are being filled with smoke. So who knows what the heck is really going on with this? Meanwhile, Dagny is fixing up her cabin. She's supposedly a great, smart person, capable of anything, with enough money to do whatever she wants. So she fixes up an old cabin. And at this point, I'm noticing that these people who are supposed to be great aren't really that great. So after the Taggart Tunnel collapse, Dagny takes the train to Colorado, and it has a breakdown. There she meets a technician who knew John Galt. She just asked, "Who's John Galt?" And he's like, "Oh, you don't know? I know him." This is where Randians take a pot shot at distributarian businesses, saying that Galt worked at this 20th Century Motor Company, and the owner decided that he was going to pay everybody according to their need, and Dagny's like, "Well, how are you going to know what everyone needs?" You know, so this is already kind of a setup conversation with a particular dynamic and paradigm that only Rand is really just talking about. She's talking to herself about a hypothetical, and she's not actually basing it in reality. So anyway, going on. The technician says that the better employees worked harder and the needier ones got needier, because there's supposedly no way to know a person's needs. Except that there is. And the people in companies who make the big money are not the ones who work hardest or best necessarily. I mean, for goodness sake, there was a guy who worked for, I think it was Pacific Gas and Electric, who quit after one day, and all of his work consisted of resigning. He sat down at the executive's desk, wrote a letter of resignation, and quit, and he got millions of dollars in severance from that. Not even kidding. So, at this point, the myth of meritocracy permeates this whole part of the story like cheap perfume. The fact is that distributarian businesses try and meet the needs of their employees directly, rather than just saying, "Here's money, go and pay for what you need." You know, if employees need daycare, they find a reputable, decent daycare facility for the workers' kids, and they then get the kids in there, and they pay for the daycare, or they subsidize the daycare so that the parents only have to pay a certain amount. Same thing with healthcare and dental. They get a contract with a particular healthcare provider. The healthcare provider then provides healthcare at a certain set cost or whatever. And the other thing is that a distributarian company is not some benevolent, come and work here and we don't care how well you work kind of thing. because they are not afraid to lay off bad employees. So they want the proverbial strongest links to remain. They don't want bad employees to stick around. They want the company's best and brightest to have a share in the company. That's part of the reason why they have distributarian businesses, is so that you own a share in the company and you'll work harder. And you may be loyal to your coworkers, but you're not necessarily only loyal to them. You're loyal to the company as well. It ensures company loyalty by basically making the union and the shop one entity. And then the workers are the owners. Now, Galt doesn't stand for a distributarian business, so he quits, and later on the business fails. So in this analogy of Rand's, the 20th century motor company is what happens when the heirs to a business turn it from a despotism into a communist state. But, as I said, worker-owned businesses still fire people. Rand just doesn't like any ideas other than her own. So when people propose a different way that isn't based on selfishness, she barely gives it a moment's thought and contrives a way that it wouldn't work, even if it's not necessarily based on how that actually works, what kinds of checks and balances they put into the system to make sure that it functions effectively and isn't taken advantage of by people with less than, honest intentions. Distributarian businesses don't pay according to need. They pay everyone equally, but everyone works equally. Whether it's an hourly salary or a weekly one at full-time hours, it works out to the same amount of money annually, and your share in the company is equivalent to that. But if you're a drag on the company, then they will let you go and give you the cash value of your share in the company. So you have an investment there at stake. So it's in your best interest to say, if I can't do this job, then I can't do this job, and I should not continue to work at this job in this capacity. Okay, so what gets me is that Dagny is told all about the 20th Century Motor Company in Part 1, as I'll discuss in a bit, but acts as if it's the first time she hears about it in Part 2. Probably because nobody saw Part 1. And even then, that beginning scene with the airplane is actually the end scene from the end of the film. You don't see any additional material after that. You're getting the climax of the end of the second film, beginning of the third film, at the onset of the second film. So you're not even starting where you're supposed to. They're trying to build up drama by foreshadowing this, but it makes no sense to actually do that for the purposes of storytelling. It's meant to be some kind of frou-frou artsy thing, but it doesn't work, and any storyteller worth their salt would not do this. Okay, the other thing that I should bring up is that Order 10289 is no different from Congress ordering a sequester and threatening to shut down the government. 10289 is the order that no business can produce anything new or produce any new amounts of things or anything like that. That the whole world basically has to freeze as it is in order to somehow make things better. Well, anyway, that's basically the same as Congress ordering a shutdown of the government for not approving a budget. In either case, it's trying to improve a situation by putting a stranglehold on everything. Rand's logic throughout the novel ultimately fails her, as it is anything but objective, even though it's called objectivism. Her basic paradigm is that everyone who disagrees with her is wrong, so everyone had better just shut up and listen to her already. By the way, Rand did collect Social Security in her later years, so for all her talk, she survived thanks to the very government system she claimed to despise. This is why it's not really objectivism, it's subjectivism, and why a lot of people just call it Randianism instead. Randians are pretty often very unsatisfied, unfulfilled people who say they're part of this great class of people, but don't bother to really do anything magnanimous or noteworthy, apart from forcing their opinion on others. So, naturally, after the scene with the train exchange all about who John Galt is, where it's supposed to be this big reveal after we've been wondering all this time, even though we already knew, somehow Dagny knows how to fly a plane. We're not told how she knows how to fly a plane, but she can. And she has enough money that she can hire a plane and take it off. And this includes a Gulfstream jetliner, which is not necessarily an easy plane to fly, apparently. So, the film ends exactly where it left off, and really this makes the whole start of the film before the title utterly pointless. Because, as I said, we have no idea what she's doing in a plane. We don't. She's just in a plane. So to Randians, I'm sure that this was riveting storytelling, but they could have just gone into the continuing story at the beginning and then gotten to this climax, or they could have found a better place to end part one at, and then gotten to part two. Instead of doing this weird plane thing, because they ended at one point where the train is stopped, and then they really should be picking up from there. They could have ended it with her saying, "Who is John Galt?" and then the guy saying, "Oh, you John Galt, I knew him." She turns her head and cut to black, and that's the end of the story. And I want to say that's actually how part one ended, and they could have gone with that and had a lot more interesting story, and they wouldn't have had to repeat that one scene that's at the very end. Okay? So then part two starts with the end, which is insane. You don't do that. Not if it's not really important to the storytelling. It's just saying, well, this is where we're going to be at the end. Okay, but you could have left that for the end. Tell the story chronologically. Anyway, it's interesting to note that they gave the cast in alphabetical order at the end. And now that I've watched part two, I'll get into my review of part one eventually. Part 3 is coming out this year, 2014, and I think when I read it, I didn't get much further than this part of the story. I got into what happens a little bit in part 3, but it was boring, it was uninteresting, it got even more and more arrogant and, oh, I'm so wonderful kind of stuff. And I'll give you a little bit of a look ahead. Ayn Rand, there's a magical valley that's hidden from the world by certain magnetic fields that apparently John Galt or somebody found, and he basically set up a colony there that has no government, so people just rule things on a barter system, either exchanging goods or services or certain tokens and whatnot, and Ayn Rand put herself as living there and saying that this was her place, that she was an author who couldn't put up with the rest of the world. She doesn't bother to name herself, but it is so clearly the author. And she's just waving and smiling and happy there. La la la. Yeah, if you have to imagine a world separate from the rest of society that you have to live in order to be happy, you're not really that great a person, because great people are usually pretty adaptable and able to function in some capacity within society, and they're able to influence society enough. If they're truly great, they're able to influence society enough, at least around them, that they can then live comfortably and happily. They find the niches that they can exist in, and they explore those avenues. So there's this magical valley, and all the power is run off of this static motor that just gathers energy from the rest of from the air and stuff. and it's all hidden, and so everybody just has free electricity, basically. And I'm like, wait a minute, but that's altruistic. That's not what you say you ascribe to, because then you're giving away electricity. So right away, Rand's whole world doesn't really function. It breaks down the closer you look at it. Anyway, so we'll get to part one in a little bit, but first I wanted to share the review of Branded. Now, Branded is set in a future dystopia, not unlike Atlas Shrugged, only in this one, advertising is taking over people's lives and manipulating them, much like demons when they possess you or whatever, if you believe in that sort of thing. I don't, but you get the concept. This film also sets the heroes up as exceptional individuals, ones of vision and conscience and even a divine destiny, which is very similar indeed to Atlas Shrugged, where these are exceptional individuals who are destined to basically rule or lead in some capacity, or somehow overthrow the natural order, or overthrow the order that is at presently in hold. Okay. Anyway, so appropriately enough, the writer of the story is from Russia, which is like Rand, who was originally born in Russia and then emigrated because she was Jewish, and they were the Jews were fleeing from Russia. So this was back during the era of communism, so that's one of the reasons why Rand is so anti-communist, anti-socialist. So Branded, however, talks about the evils of capitalism on a formerly communist state. And the fact is that in a capitalist system, especially free market capitalism, which doesn't actually exist really, only the advertising companies really make money. But if you try to have everything be free market, basically only the advertising companies make money on that system. Because it's, oh, you have to buy our brand. No, you have to buy our brand. So advertising has to go everywhere in order to make the system work. So the sound and cinematography on this film is excellent just within the first 5 minutes, and I had no idea what was going on exactly in the first 5 minutes, but it looked and sounded good. So that's saying something. Contrasting that with Atlas Shrugged, the sound and cinematography was not so good in that one. Anyway, our hero's name is Misha, and as a boy, he's running to get something from the store back under communism when there's a huge long line, and he sees visions in the stars. As he runs to go get something, he gets struck by lightning, and an old woman says he will live an interesting life. He grows up to become an award-winning advertising executive who's getting shortchanged by his boss. Meanwhile, in another part of town, Max von Sydow plots to make fat beautiful in the public consciousness. Misha goes on a strange journey full of religious symbolism, love, and a vision that comes to him in the night that starts him on a quest. The writing and storytelling are really different and make the entire journey amazing. After building a pyre to sacrifice a bull, the symbol of the Ad Awards happened to be a golden bull, and this one is a red bull. He bathes himself in a solution of the ashes of the sacrificial pyre. This is called the sacrifice of the red cow, which purifies you from sin, according to Kabbalah. When he wakes, he sees strange creatures on everyone around him in the city of Moscow. The creatures swell when they are being satisfied by purchases, and then part of them float off into the sky to join larger masses of the same creatures. He quickly realizes that using the products only builds an unsatisfiable need for the products. The points raised in this film are amazingly deep and poetic. The brands used to be made according to people's desires, but now it is the people made according to the desires of the brands. This is what Shakespeare scholars call the natural order being disturbed. Branded is easily comparable to Terry Gilliam's Brazil in story, style, and symbology. One of the funnier elements is Misha's advertising company is called Best Solutions, and their logo is BS, very large. I like the message of changing the system from within, even if the end seems tragic. There is a happy twist to it all, too. Branded is a human story that addresses a real issue that we have been conditioned to ignore. So, I'm going to give Branded a 4 out of 5. Actually, yeah, 4 out of 5 is good. It's an independent movie, it's a little bit low budget, but there's really nothing wrong with it. I just can't give it the full 5 out of 5 because it's a little bit hard to approach from any culture outside of Russian. But as it is, you can still appreciate it, and there's a lot to learn. So now that I've been branded, let's get back to being randed with Atlas Shrugged Part 1. The film starts in September of 2016. Gee, I wonder if they're trying to say something about the Obama administration. They even have a bad voice actor doing an impression of President Obama. So let's not pretend that this film is anything other than propaganda at this point. All they're talking about is oil as the only energy source. This is part of the problem with the Randian perspective. 19th century ideals to deal with 21st century problems. They skip over a lot of the book and jump into some of the intrigue. It's made clear that in Rand's world, emotions aren't valued, and yet Reardon and Dagny have sex at some point in the film. So what is their relationship based on? Because apathetic people don't tend to love anyone. What strikes me, having seen Part 2, first is that many of the actors and sets changed except for the Taggart office sets and a handful of actors. Within the first 20 minutes, there's a view that monopolies are good, except that monopolies crush innovative competition and cause markets to stagnate under their total control, and they are often run by nepotism, which causes the corporations to be badly managed by people like James Taggart. So, if you're in favor of a competitive market for goods and services, then you can't be in favor of monopolies. Dagny tells us that she's an engineer by education. This still doesn't explain why in Part 2 she knows how to fly a jet. Anyway, naturally, just like Apple in Part 2, Dell computers are used in Part 1 because the owner put his name on the company, and if he controlled it as despotically as Apple's Steve Jobs did in life, then they'd put Dell everywhere, I'm sure. One major inconsistency is that Dagny is supposed to be in New York City, and yet in her scene in the limousine 30 minutes in, you can clearly see palm trees in the background. Sadly, it just shows how low the budget is for the first part. The second part, by comparison, uses what is clearly a lot of blue or green screen sets to save on budget, but it also makes things look really fake. At the Reardon's anniversary party, they try to get fancy by doing most of the scene in one long, continuous take, moving the camera between people. It's a lame trick meant to show off the capabilities of the crew, actors, and director. But I now understand why they can't keep actors on the project with work like this, having to do one take over and over, very possibly the course of days. It's pretentious. If a bunch of so-called objectivists decide to seclude themselves from the world in 2016, trust me, I'll be fine with it, even if they wreck up their mines, factories, and such, and leave all their assets behind. Let them. They think they can get by without the support of others, that emotions are just sentiment, that things matter more than people, and that Ubuntu is just romantic altruism. The elites will want for everything because they never bothered to learn how to do for themselves. These movies make a big point of how these wealthy people always give money and gratitude for a service, but once again, that is now not how the actual world works for these people. They don't give money to those who do work for them, not if they can get away with giving nothing. and they certainly aren't grateful for what they get from others. There is no fair exchange in the mind of wealthy Randians. If Hank Reardon were in business, he wouldn't sell his metal even close to at cost. He would hike up the price or sell it at the same price as regular steel so that he could make more of a profit on it. That's what business owners do. Reardon is shown caring for injured men in his mill, but most owners would sooner have that person fired and sent home that day, then charge them for damage to their property. Make no mistake, I personally enjoy being rewarded with what I've earned. I appreciate vision, drive, and willingness to create and build, but the very things that Rand and her followers praise are that which stand in the way of progress. When you love what you do and you do what you love, muscle aches are a song of praise to having put in the effort, and sleep and a good meal are the best they've ever been. It's a joy and serenity that few understand, nor can they even fathom. As it is, Atlas Shrugged basically just meanders along through the first third of the book, and then comes to a very non-plus ending. It doesn't really surprise you, it doesn't really intensify, it just kind of goes and then stops. And then it's like, wait for part 2, this is to be continued. We're going to have a rip-snorting adventure with a bunch of independent, wealthy people who don't need anyone because they're capable of doing anything they set their mind to, and they all have special abilities far beyond those of everybody else, and that's what makes them so wonderful, and that's why Ayn Rand is one of them, because then she can go and live in the magical valley with all her imaginary friends. I'm sorry, that was really snarky and cynical, but that's just the reality, I'm afraid. So, Atlas Shrugged Parts 1 and 2 gets a 0 out of 5.